everyone. Welcome to the first of what we hope will be an annual event hosted by the Boston College Graduate Theory Colloquium. My name is Kelsey Norwood.
I'm Nell Wasserstrom.
We're the co-directors of the Theory Colloquium, and we started this organization to try to expose graduate students to emerging and relevant theoretical discourses that could bring alternative perspectives to graduate research and intellectual growth. The Colloquium is a cross-disciplinary project, so we seek to bring in topics and speakers who will appeal to students and faculty both within the humanities and beyond the humanities. And we are very pleased and excited to welcome Carrie Wolf as our first guest speaker.
Over the past year, a group of graduate students and faculty from across the disciplines have been meeting on a monthly basis to discuss various texts related to Professor Wolf's research. We would like to take this opportunity to thank the dedicated members of our working group, as well as the faculty members who supported us along the way, particularly Professors Robert Stanton and Kalpana Seshadri for your help and advice during this whole process. We would also like to thank, very importantly, the chair of the English department, Professor Suzanne Matson, Dean Candace Hetzner from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and Professor Mary Crane from the Institute for the Liberal Arts. Their generous support has made this evening's event possible. So, thank you all for coming. And now we would like to welcome to the podium Professor Kalpana Seshadri, who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, folks. So I want to begin by first thanking Nell and Kelsey for their vision and leadership in organizing the graduate colloquium devoted to theory and focusing the year on animal studies. They've done a stellar job, really incredible, of bringing faculty and students together to reflect on a topic that will always be, in my view, no matter how fast we run, at the distant frontiers of thought. Perhaps this is largely because the so-called animal, right, of animal studies is not so much an object of analysis or even a pressing issue such as climate change, neoliberalism, democracy, or distributive justice, topics of such overwhelming urgency that we are often deafened by their clamor. Rather, the appearance of the animal in our discourse is stealthier. It is merely that which we can never and will never catch up with. And this is not because the animal is swifter on its feet or fleeter on its wing, but because the noun animal designates for us an unsettling alterity, a way of thinking and contending and being dislocated by the other, as something other that throws the one, capital one, who questions into question. So we have with us today Professor Carrie Wolf, whose name literally carries the animal we're gradually learning to think with. So synonymous is Professor Wolf with the field of animal studies that to read him is to be confronted again, and for the first time, with the question of what it means, as Derrida would say in his, I think, wonderful meditation of Celan's animal poem, to carry the other. Some of you might recall the last line of Celan's poem, "The world is gone, I must carry you," that Derrida repeats throughout Brahms, saying that to carry now means to carry oneself bear oneself toward the infinite inappropriability of the other, toward the encounter with its absolute transcendence in the very inside of me, that is to say, outside of me. So if to carry then is to signify a supporting and a transporting, I can think of no one who has done more to mediate and channel the resources of contemporary continental thought and American pragmatism than Carrie Wolf. Whether this is readings of Derrida, Emerson, Foucault, Nicholas Luhmann, Stanley Cavell, etc., or his carefully curated nurturing of other scholars in the fields, or his numerous edited collections, special issues of Tier 1 journals, and the Post-Humanities series at the University of Minnesota Press, Carrie has brought a world of inquiry into our purview. And it's a strange and wonderful world, indeed, populated by not so beastly humans and not so inhuman beasts. So I should not here recount his numerous accomplishments, way too many, but shall limit myself to merely mentioning that he is currently Bruce and Elizabeth Dunleavy Professor of English and Director of the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory at Rice University. He's the author of at least 5, to my knowledge, single-authored books. Am I right about that, Carrie? Yeah, 5, yeah. The Limits of American Literary Ideology in Pound and Emerson from Cambridge, Critical Environments from Minnesota, Animal Rights, which is a big book, I think, just fabulous. Animal Rights, American Culture, The Discourse of Species and Posthumanist Theory, came out from Chicago. What is Posthumanism, which I think the group read, colloquium together, yeah. And Before the Law, Humans and Other Animals in a Biopolitical Frame. And he's edited, on top of everything else, numerous volumes of essays, the most widely disseminated among them being, no doubt, Zoologies from Minnesota. So he's currently finishing his 6th book, or maybe his 7th?
Oh.
Yeah, right, that's what I thought. And I believe the last one that he just finished is called Wallace Stevens' Birds, The Poetics of Extinction, right? So he writes so much, and such very good books, that truly it's an honor for us that he's made the time to visit us here at BC. So without further ado, let's then welcome Professor Carrie Wolf.
Okay, thanks for that generous introduction. As Kalpana knows, I'm a huge fan of her work. In fact, I'm teaching a graduate seminar right now called After Biopolitics, in which we just read about 80 pages of her book, Humanimal, that's in the Posthumanities series. I think it's some of the best comparative work on Derrida and Agamben ever done by anybody, even if you're not interested in the ostensible topic of the book. So that's why I made my students read it. It's great to be back in Boston. I walked the Freedom Trail yesterday for the first time since I was 8 years old, all the way to Bunker Hill. So that was a great experience. I've been having a great visit. Actually, I'm not going to say much by way of preamble because I'm going to warn you this is a long talk. A little bit longer than I want it to be. I hope it doesn't feel long. But I'm actually completing 2 books right now. One book, the title has changed slightly. It's called Wallace Stevens' Birds or Ecological Poetics. And that's actually not the text I'm going to speak from today. I'm going to give you a snapshot, actually, of the other book project I'm working on, which in a way is sort of a sequel to Before the Law, my last book. Not so much focused on animals, but on the question, really on the question of the political. And how do we rethink what the political is in light of the immunitary turn, so-called, in biopolitical thought, which is where sort of the book Before the Law ends up. So Timothy Morton, his work you may know, he and I have been running a year-long seminar at Rice through the Humanities Research Center called After Biopolitics, and we've really been focused a lot on political theory and political philosophy and trying to think the ways in which the political can be, the question of the political can be kind of reinserted into a rethinking of social relations and a theory of social complexity in ways that are involved with the animal but aren't thematically, necessarily focused on and limited to the animal. So that, the question of the animal, quote unquote. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is some of the work from that book, and I don't know what that book will be called yet, but this is kind of a précis of what I'll be doing there. So, as I said, the talk's a little bit long, so settle in, and if I see anybody snoring, I'll, toss something in your direction and try to rouse you. Okay, so there's been a lot of interest recently, as you all probably know, in what Roberto Esposito calls the possibility of thinking an affirmative biopolitics that runs counter to the dominant trend in biopolitical thought thus far, namely the thanato-political cast that seems inevitable when we confront the increasing implication of life as a direct object of political power and manipulation. Esposito's key intervention, as is well known, is to insist that the secret to understanding modern biopolitical formations is realizing that their fundamental logic is one of immunity. What I want to do here is to use the immunological paradigm as a jumping off point to see what new resources for political thought reveal themselves when we return to the isomorphism between the immunological paradigm and the theory of self-referential autopoietic systems handed down to us from second-order systems theory. This will in turn open up new lines of connection between the immunological paradigm, systems theory, deconstruction, and pragmatism, and will in particular reveal some of the ways that social systems theory may be used to extend and indeed radicalize the work of Michel Foucault himself on biopolitics. Why radicalize? Because what we find in Foucault is a thinker divided, I would say, between two tendencies. On the one hand, Foucault is primarily concerned, as he famously put it, not with power, but with the processes by which individuals are made subjects. And to that extent, Foucault's work remains within a semantics of the person and the individual that the other side of Foucault attempts to move beyond. That's the Foucault whose primary project is to think the increasingly complex logics of social formations and how the political has to be rethought and reinserted within them. A project directly in line with the structural Marxism of his mentor, Louis Althusser, in his attempt to theorize what he called structural causality. This is the Foucault who famously theorizes the transition from disciplinarity to governmentality in biopolitics, and the relationship of the latter to liberalism. It must be said, however, that this Foucault remains within what systems theory would call an essentially first-order logic of the operations of governmentality, even as his attention to what systems theory would call the contingency and self-reference of governmentality's various forms of power knowledge would seem to point our investigations beyond that first-order orientation. And here's precisely where Luhmann radicalizes Foucault, I think, in his turn towards second-order logics of social complexity, as in this contention that stands in contrast to Foucault's account of governmentality. Luhmann writes, quote, "World society has reached a higher level of complexity with higher structural contingencies, more unexpected and unpredictable changes. Some people call this chaos. And above all, more interlinked dependencies and interdependencies. This means that causal connections, causal constructions, calculations, plannings, and so on are no longer possible from a central and therefore objective point of view," unquote. And this means, for example, recalling Foucault's discussion of medicalization as a component of governmentality, that, quoting again, highly efficient modern medicine has demographic consequences. That is, advances in medicine lead to all kinds of social and economic problems, such as imbalance in numbers between the old and the young, and increasing healthcare costs, unquote. To put it another way then, where Foucault sees steering and management largely achieving their first-order goals under governmentality, Luhmann sees a second-order logic at work, in which systems unwittingly increase, and in a non-linear way, the very social complexity that they attempt to reduce and control through their operations. And it's this qualitative shift that Deleuze is concerned about in his book on Foucault and in his late remarks on control society, which I'll come back to later in this talk. Now, when we explore these connections between systems theory and the immunitary paradigm more deeply, they open up avenues to think anew several important questions to which Esposito's work has drawn our attention, including the relationship between community, melancholy, guilt, and lack, which, while not thanatological, remains within an ambit that thinks the political in an essentially tragic vein, and the central question that both Esposito and Jacques Derrida quite brilliantly raise, namely, as Esposito puts it, that autoimmunity expresses, quote, the logic of the immune system in its pure state, so to speak, unquote. That what needs explaining, he continues, is not the fact that in some cases the immune system attacks its own parts, but the fact that this normally does not happen, unquote. A crucial problem for politics that we will want to address then is the problem of controlling autoimmunity. Where this control comes from and what its logic is will lead us on a brief detour through Deleuze's suggestive late remarks on control society, again rearticulated through the apparatus of systems theory, the better to show how what we might call a restricted and indeed weak sense of the political of the sort we find in Luhmann's work thus has a much more complex and fruitful relationship to an understanding of biopolitics, focused not on the problem of sovereignty, as in Agamben or Schmidt, for example, but on material dispositifs and apparatuses, one that constitutes a more complex dynamics of political effectivity in an increasingly heterogeneous field of biopolitical actors and agents, not all of them human, of course. Now, as you all know, or probably know, Esposito takes up the immunitary paradigm in many places in his work, and he argues that Foucault never really fully develops the immunitary logic of biopolitics that he identifies in his lectures. For his part, Esposito insists that a turn away from the thanatological workings of biopolitics and a turn toward an affirmative biopolitics can only take place if life as such, not just human versus animal life, not just Aryan versus Jewish life, not just Christian versus Islamic life, becomes the subject of immunitary protection. And this is so, he argues, because, quote, there's never a moment in which the individual can be enclosed in himself or blocked in a closed system and so removed from the movement that binds him to his own biological matrix, unquote. And this leads in turn to Esposito's retrofitting of Spinoza's concept of natural right to make, quote, the norm the principle of unlimited equivalence for every single form of life, unquote. Now, excuse me, while I share Esposito's interest in framing the possibility of an affirmative biopolitics, I also share Eugene Thacker's observation in his book After Life that if all forms of life are taken to be equal, then it can only be because they, as the living, all equally embody and express a positive substantive principle of life, capital L, not contained in any one of them. The problem, he continues, quoting now, is that once one considers something like life in itself, whether in the form of a life principle or some other inaccessible first principle, then one must also effectively dissociate life from the living, unquote. So I want to come at this question of an affirmative biopolitics and the relation between life and the living and the political by approaching it from a different direction, from the inside out, you might say, rather than from the outside in. And to do that, I think we have to begin at the beginning, with the systems theoretical nature and background of the immunitary paradigm itself. As I mentioned earlier, Esposito engages systems theory directly in several places. In terms of the political, for example, he writes that Luhmann's work, quote, constitutes the most refined articulation of immunitary logic as a specific form of modernization, unquote, which he summarizes along the following lines, and this is a long quotation from Esposito. The problem of systematically controlling dangerous environmental conflicts is resolved not only through a simple reduction of environmental complexity, but instead through its transformation from exterior complexity to a complexity that's internal to the system itself. To this first strategy of interiorization, however, which is activated by an immunitary process, a second is added, which is much more laden with consequences for environmental difference, namely its complete inclusion within the system or its objective elimination. This development in Luhmann's thought, he continues, which occurs when he adopts the biological concept of autopoiesis, shifts the lens from the defensive level of the systemic government of the environment to an internal self-regulation of systems that is completely independent and autonomous with regard to environmental pressures, unquote. Now, without lingering over the rather exaggerated claim completely independent and autonomous that Esposito attributes to Luhmann, wrongly I think, let me suggest that a better analogy for the systems theory logic of immunity is one that Esposito himself has used elsewhere, namely the logic of Derrida's pharmacon, which is, quote, opposed to its other not by excluding it, but on the contrary by incorporating and vicariously substituting it, unquote. Let me explain this analogy in a bit more detail. The equivalent of the immunitary pharmacon is, in systems theory, the autopoietic system that uses its own self-reference to process overwhelming environmental complexity, which means not completely independent, but all too dependent, so that, as Luhmann often puts it, when the distinction between system and environment is re-entered within the system's own self-referential code, the difference or distinction, as in Derrida's pharmacon, is, quote, the same and not the same, unquote. Moreover, any system must remain blind to this paradoxical fact of its own self-reference if it wants to continue to use that code to process and reduce environmental complexity. The legal system, for example, could hardly admit that both sides of the distinction legal-illegal are in fact a self-produced product of only one side of the distinction, namely the legal. It could hardly admit, that is, that the system is founded on the tautology legal is legal, because that would collapse the distinction on which its operations depend. It's not that people in the legal system don't know this, it's that they must suspend or ignore this knowledge if they want the legal system to function. Otherwise, there would be no ground, however ex nihilo and suspended over a void, as Zizek might say, for distinguishing the legal from the illegal. We, or they, as second-order observers, can disclose that paradox and that tautology, but only from the vantage of another system using another code, which is in turn bound by the same formal logic that governs all autopoietic social systems. Hence, in these terms, the outside, the environment, is always the outside of a particular inside, a fact that's perhaps easier to grasp in biological and evolutionary work on the autopoiesis of perception and consciousness, reaching all the way back to Jakob von Uxkall's work on human and animal Umwelten, and forward to philosophers of mind such as Alvin Noe, who reminds us that, quote, it's not the case that all animals have a common external environment, because to each different form of animal life there is a distinct corresponding ecological domain or habitat, which means that all animals live in structured worlds, or in the terms of Derrida's second set of seminars on the beast and the sovereign, as he puts it, there is no world. So the famous included exclusion of biopolitical thought as the very figure of sovereignty qua state of exception, as both constituted and constituting violence, as immunity qua indemnity, as Derrida puts it, and so on, is a product of the re-entry of the system-environment distinction within the system's own self-referential terms. And at this juncture then, I think we're in a position to specify in some detail, against the more familiar backdrop of Derrida's work, some of the problems with Esposito's conjugation of the relationship between immunity and community in relation to the political. Problems that situate his discourse in an essentially tragic frame that we will want to question later in these remarks. Like Derrida, Esposito realizes that, quote, the idea of immunity, which is needed for protecting our life, if carried past a certain threshold, winds up negating life, so that not only is our freedom, but also the very meaning of our individual and collective existence lost. That flow of meaning, that encounter with existence outside of itself that I define with the term communitas, unquote. And like Derrida, he sees the semantics of the person in the individual as inadequate to the task of thinking questions of community, democracy, and so on. Quote, one cannot base a philosophy of community on a metaphysics of the individual, he writes. Instead, he argues, and this is a quotation from Esposito, he argues, what else is community if not the lack of one's own? This is the meaning that is etymologically inscribed with the very munus from which communitas is derived, and that it carries within itself as its own non-belonging to itself, not as a not belonging or an impropriety of all the members that make up a community through a reciprocal distortion, which is the distortion of community itself. If community is nothing but the relation, the with or the between, that joins multiple subjects, this means that it cannot be a subject, individual, or collective, unquote. But if community in this sense is impossible, as he puts it, if indeed it's nothing but the conjunctive and, as it were, formal relation of difference of the with or the between, as he puts it, then it's not at all clear how the question of community countenances the entire semantic nexus of lack, guilt, debt, perversion, distortion, and so on, that eventuates in Esposito's key claim that, quote, melancholy is not something that community contains along with other attitudes, postures, or possibilities, but something by which community itself is contained and determined, unquote. Resembling, and I'm quoting again, a fault or a wound that community experiences not as a temporary or partial condition, but as community's only way of being, unquote. The problem is not just, excuse me, that such a formulation would seem to thrust us back into the domain of the person and the individual. I mean, after all, isn't it only persons that experience melancholy and guilt? Rather, the primary problem can be brought into sharper focus by remembering the distinction Derrida makes in many places in his early work between lack and absence. An absence generated by the force of iterability, the trace, différance, and so on. An absence that must be thought without nostalgia, as he puts it in the essay Différance. Rather than launching into a long discussion of Derrida's early work at this juncture, I'll rely here on Matthias Fritzsche's able summary. As Fritzsch writes, quote, "Différance names the empty gap, the differential relation between elements without which they cannot function. Secondly, however, the deferral aspect of différance also signals that the differentiation process never comes to a close, but is begun anew with each new instance of an element's use or occurrence. The future to come thus implies that identity is infinitely divided against itself, and hence, in open-ended and unforeseeable ways, infiltrated with the otherness needed to establish it," unquote. And what this means, and it's why Derridian différance cannot be assimilated to Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction, as Chantal Mouffe tries to do in her discussion of democratic antagonism, is that, quote, "the relation between identity and its other is not exclusionary of a clearly demarcated outside. As for Derrida, identity is not so much marked by excluding defined others, but by the infinite porosity of a supposed inside and outside, and hence its constant renegotiation," unquote. Now, a few crucial points follow from this. First, time is thus constitutive of the system-environment relationship for Derrida as it is for systems theory, a point that Martin Hagelin has made well in his book-length study of Derrida called Radical Atheism. Or to combine the terms of systems theory and deconstruction, the formal element of a system can never be characterized by any kind of basal simplicity because its meaning depends upon the real-time dynamic states of the system in which the element functions, what Derrida would call the moment of the element's performativity or its iteration. For Derrida, this mitigates against all forms of sovereignty, conceived as what he calls ipseity, or the self-same, which are faithfully imbricated in this dynamic once they performatively attempt to enact or declare themselves as such. Secondly, a related point that derives from this first. Esposito may be right that our mortal finitude, as he puts it, assumes the form of reciprocal care, and that, quote, care rather than interest lies at the basis of community, unquote. A view shared by Derrida, by Simone Weil, by Cora Diamond, and others, as I've discussed elsewhere, namely Before the Law. But what Esposito seems to both invite and ignore, invite by his seemingly Derridian insistence that community is nothing but the spacing of the with and the between of individual subjects, and ignore by his reinscription of what Derrida would call a phantasmatic being able that sets up such finitude as a fault, as a wound, as a perversion, as a lack, in other words, rather than an absence, is a more profound understanding of what I've elsewhere called double finitude. Our finitude, not just as embodied and invulnerable beings who need care, but also as ones who, to enter into communicative and social bonds with others at all, are by necessity subjected to the not me and the not ours of semiotic systems characterized by différance and the trace that, as Derrida puts it, quote, must be extended to the entire field of the living, or rather to the life-death relation beyond the anthropological limits of spoken language, unquote. It's not just human beings, in other words, who are subjected to the finitude of différance and the trace. Any creature that engages in communicative semiotic behavior is. And that means that this second form of finitude is not held in reserve for a human who can thereby be ontologically separated from other forms of life. And third, and crucially, this has profound implications for Esposito's rendering of the immunitary paradigm of biopolitics, which in this light seems to reify the inside-outside relation in arguing that, quote, whereas communitas opens, exposes, and turns individuals inside out, freeing them to their exteriority, immunitas returns individuals to themselves and closes them once again in their own skin. Immunitas, he continues, brings the outside inside, eliminating whatever part of the individual that lies outside, unquote. What such a characterization misses, I think, is not just the infinite porosity and constant renegotiation of the inside-outside relation noted by Frisch above, but also what I've called the second-order turn of systems theory, which holds that, contrary to the understanding of autopoietic systems as solipsistic, the operational closure of systems and the self-reference based upon it arise as a practical necessity and an adapted necessity precisely because systems are not closed. That is, precisely because they find themselves in an environment of overwhelmingly and exponentially greater complexity than is possible for any single system. To put it another way, systems have to operate selectively and blindly, as Luhmann puts it, not because they're closed, but precisely because they aren't closed. And the asymmetrical distribution of complexity across the system-environment difference is in fact what forces the strategy of self-referential closure in autopoiesis. From this vantage, we can now see more clearly the cascade of problems that eventuates from Esposito's seemingly innocent and commonsensical assertion that, quote, we have always existed in common. An assertion that not only seems counterfactual in light of the question of world, as re-articulated through work in biological systems theory reaching back to Jakob von Uexküll, but also that begs the question, from what Archimedean vantage point is such an assertion to be made, surmounting, as it appears to do, the constraints and finitude of self-reference. But what if we begin, instead, not with commonality, but with difference and alterity? The finitude and situatedness from which we all blindly set out. And, with Donna Haraway, see that, quote, immune system discourse is about constraint and possibility for engaging in a world full of difference, replete with non-self. From this perspective, she continues, immunity doesn't mean isolation. It can also be conceived in terms of shared specificities, of the semi-permeable self able to engage with others, human and non-human, inner and outer, but always with finite consequences, of situated possibilities and impossibilities of individuation and identification, and of partial fusions and dangers, unquote. We're now in a better position, I think, to stress two important points that follow from this quick crash course in systems theory deconstruction and how Esposito's handling of the immunity-community pair may be situated in it. First, this means, as Esposito puts it, that for autopoietic immune systems, the task is not to protect the body from conflicts, but rather through conflicts. Indeed, to look forward to the Material and Control Society later in this essay, to use conflict in the system to manage and respond, but in a non-representational way, to conflicts in the broader environment. Second, this means that the immunitary relation between system and environment always operates on the basis of a radical complexity differential between the environment and any system, which is, in fact, the driver, as I've already said, for the system's use of self-referential selection. Or as Luhmann puts it, quote, the system's inferiority and complexity must be counterbalanced by strategies of selection, unquote, since it's obviously impossible for any system to establish point-for-point correspondences in real time between its internal elements and every moment-to-moment change going on in the rest of its universe. What this means, and this has been a key insight since the first order systems theory of one of my intellectual heroes, Gregory Bateson, is that the consequences of a particular event or utterance or act depend less on their semantic and informatic formal characteristics than on the dynamic state of the system itself. Or as Luhmann puts it in Social Systems, quote, "A piece of information that's repeated is no longer information. It retains its meaning in the repetition, but it loses its value as information. One reads in the paper that the Deutschmark has risen in value. If one reads this a second time in another paper, the activity no longer has value as information. It no longer changes the state of the system, although structurally it presents the same selection," unquote. So what all the foregoing draws our attention to is the intensely non-generic and transversal, to use Deleuze's term, character of the bio of biopolitics in its Foucauldian articulation. How it's essentially a strategic problem for the political, one that's conjugated and reconjugated anew under very specific coordinates and conditions. This is why, as Hans-Georg Müller points out, Habermas was in fact right when he called Luhmann's systems theory metabiological, because, quote, I'm quoting Müller now, "It follows evolutionary biology in denying transcendental agency and free will. That is to say, by definition, that an ecosystem has no center. Evolution does not follow any guidelines or directives given by any of its subsystems," unquote. And in turn, he continues, quoting again, "The partial blindness that comes with evolution also implies a certain ethical and pragmatic blindness. Since it's impossible to see everything, it is also impossible to see what is good for all," unquote. The point I'll come back to at the end of my remarks. Of course, if everything we've just said is true of social systems in the context of modernity understood, as Luhmann puts it, as a process of functional differentiation into horizontally distributed, a non-hierarchical field of social systems, then it's also true by definition of the political system. In this light, we might well view this fact, in Luhmann's theory generally, as a description of what Deleuze in his late remarks calls control society. Not least of all because for Luhmann, as we know, the constitutive elements of social systems are not persons or individuals, but communications, a central feature of control society that Deleuze borrows from none other than William S. Burroughs. Indeed, for Deleuze, writing on the heels of his book on Foucault, what characterizes societies of control is their shift from analog to digital forms of communication that are smooth and continuous across what were, in disciplinary societies, qualitatively different social sites. As Gregory Flaxman puts it, quote, "Where modern disciplinary societies aggregated individuals into so many analogical sites, the factory is a prison, the school is a prison, and so on, control societies develop inseparable variations, forming a system of varying geometry whose language is digital," unquote. If we understand digital here to mean a logic that is discrete and non-representational, but at the same time formally isomorphic across various social systems, then the usefulness of the Luhmannian architecture comes readily into view, I think. In control society, the person or the individual undergoes a peculiar process of continuous modulation, like a snake shedding its coils, to use Deleuze's enigmatic phrase. Rather than being confined in disciplinary spaces and their protocols of enclosure and regimentation, subjects in societies of control move fluidly from one site to the next. Instead of initiations and the guilds, we have telecommuting, distance learning, and online defensive driving courses. This is the sense in which, as it is often said, control liberates. As Eugene Thacker and Alexander Galloway characterize it, quote, "In control societies, bodies are consonant with more distributed modes of individuation that enable their infinite variation. Informatic records, databases, consumer profiles, genetic codes, identity shopping, workplace biometrics, and the like. Express yourself, output some data," they write. "This is precisely how distributed control functions best," unquote. Luhmann's theory of the exclusion of the concrete individual in social systems gives us an especially incisive account of this logic. As Dietrich Schwanitz summarizes it, quote, "For Luhmann, the individual human being belongs to each of these functionally differentiated subsystems for only short periods of time, with only limited aspects of his person depending on his respective role as a voter, pupil, reader, patient, or litigant. It is his fundamental exclusion from society that allows the occasional re-entry of the individual under particular circumstances. Modern society develops a semantics of individuality that regards the individual as alien, unfamiliar, unpredictable, and free," unquote. Esposito is indeed right, therefore, that for Luhmann, quote, "with respect to the system, one is therefore included by exclusion and excluded by inclusion," unquote. And that, in these terms, as he puts it, community is immunity, unquote. Here, however, I think we have to remember the metabiological and ecological aspect of systems theory, and in particular its acentric character and its exponential difference between environmental complexity and systemic autopoiesis. From this vantage, what we might characterize as the control of control comes from the outside, understood as the overdetermined complexity differential in favor of the environment versus any system that would attempt to wholly dictate the actions of those who participate in it. Indeed, as Greg Lambert notes, in societies of control, unlike disciplinary societies, resistance, quote, "does not begin from a site internal to a specific power relation that can become collectivized in the general image of a mythical humanity suffering from too much oppression, as in the paradigm of the factory strike. Rather, I'm suggesting we can re-articulate the Deleuze-Foucault assertion that resistance is on the side of life in terms of what we might call the control of control that comes not from an intentional subject engaged in a representational act of defiance, the intentional exercise of freedom, express yourself, which is, after all, one of the mechanisms by which control society operates, and not from life, capital L, but rather from the weakness of the political system itself vis-a-vis the overwhelming complexity of its environment and the autonomy of the other social systems in its environment, which in turn undermines the ability of the political system or any system to unilaterally determine what life is, what the bio of biopolitics is, and so on. Environmental complexity, noise, as Bateson reminded us long ago, is the only source of new patterns, new information, and for what Foucault calls new schemas of politicization. Now, to come back down to earth a little bit, a more concrete example of how this process operates is offered by Levi Bryant's attempt to draw out some of the political implications of Luhmann's work by cross-mapping it with some terms drawn from Rancière, Badiou, and others. Bryant begins with a distinction taken from the lexicon of these thinkers that Luhmann would reject, but is nevertheless useful in this context when he writes that, quote, "much of what we often call politics is governance rather than politics. Governance consists of the manner in which a larger scale object, or system in the terms that I'm using, strives to maintain its structure or organization in its adventure across time and space by domesticating and regulating the elements of which it's composed. Politics," I'm still quoting, "by contrast, challenges the manner in which the larger scale object counts or fails to count other objects, challenges the status of those objects that animate it as elements, instead announcing themselves as parts, and sets about either severing relations to this larger scale object, demolishing this relation, or reconfiguring it. As an element or member of a set," he continues, "an element or member of a set," he continues, "exists only for the system in question and is defined relationally such that its being consists only in its relation to other elements in the system. The parts of a system, by contrast, are those other systems out of which a system constitutes its elements, are autonomous entities in their own right, and are always in excess of the elements that compose a larger scale system," unquote. So, to take an example offered by Bryant, one that has particular resonance for where I live in Houston, Texas, the fourth largest city in the United States near the border of the U.S. and Mexico. Quote, illegal immigrants are parts of the U.S. social system but are not counted as elements of the system, unquote. And they might be even more precisely included as elements in the economic system as wage earners and consumers, but excluded from the political system as voters and rights holders. Mathematically, Bryant reminds us, and I'm quoting now, and this sounds like it could have come straight out of the pages of Luhmann's book, Social Systems. Mathematically, he reminds us, quote, there are more possible relations among parts of a system than are admitted by the organization and elements of a system, unquote. Or, to put it in Luhmannian terms, the environment is always already exponentially more complex than any system, and it's precisely because systems surrender a representational relationship to that fact that they can achieve a measure of what we might call soft durability. For Bryant, then, the political, quote, takes place when a part of an object rises up within another object and contests its status as a mere element of that object or system. Politics, he concludes, thus marks the site of the volcanic anarchy that bubbles beneath any social organization. This process does not, crucially, and this is the connection to Deleuze's control society thesis, this process does not crucially avoid or repress such conflicts, the conflicts, for example, between the disrelation of the role of illegal immigrants as elements of the economic versus the political system, but rather precisely stages and generates conflicts over such issues within the political and legal domain, the better to manage them, so that those conflicts do not, outside the juridico-political system, go unchecked and run amok. And in so doing, the handling of those conflicts serves an immunitary function for society, allowing antagonism to flourish rather than hoping to overcome it in the name of the good, the beautiful, the true, or, as Schmitt complained about liberalism, in the name of reason bodied forth in the form of rational consensus. And it's precisely here, I think, that we find the rather ingenious answer to the question raised by both Esposito and Derrida. How does the political system avoid autoimmune disorder if Derrida is indeed right, as he puts it, that democracy is suicidal? The answer, according to Luhmann, is this re-entry of the political system's guiding distinction between governing and governed within the political system itself as a distinction between government and opposition, what Luhmann calls the divided top, as a means to manage conflict by staging and using and generating conflict. In doing so, the political system controls its own autoimmunity by allowing conflicts within the political system between government and opposition to serve the immunitary function of managing, but in a non-representational way, conflicts in the broader society, where Bryant's parts come from. I mean, after all, who really thinks that debates in the United States Congress between Republicans and Democrats represent the full complexity of actually existing society as a whole? As William Rausch summarizes it in his trenchant study, Sovereignty and Its Discontents, with this bifurcation at the top, quote, the governed are both included and excluded from the realm of government. That this exclusion, as necessary and inevitable as it may be, is at times felt to be oppressive, makes it all the more imperative that it, the exclusion, not be camouflaged and not be denied, unquote. In contrast to a view of the properly political that thinks that, quote, one can derive morally correct institutions from abstract universal norms, unquote, the real challenge takes on a different cast, and I'm quoting again, if we envision political and social structures that freely acknowledge the ordering and civilizing power of antagonism, where politics cannot compensate for the lack of unity, but rather, by being its effect, guarantees this lack. Decisions, in other words, he continues, can reflexively affirm their status as decisions, or they can silently deny their contingency and assume the gesture of logical subsumption. For Derrida and Lyotard, as for Schmitt, It is the unthought violence of this latter possibility that poses the greatest danger, unquote. Now, and I'm last few pages here, I promise, 3 pages. Now, as I hasten to add here, I don't think we need to buy into Rosch's attempt to assimilate Luhmann's systems theory to Schmidt's position, not least of all because Schmidt's friend-enemy distinction cannot, in my view, survive Derrida's deconstruction of it. And if that's the case, if the friend-enemy distinction doesn't elevate the political system as not just one among many, but as the most important social system, period, then we're back to the isomorphism between immunity, ipseity, self-reference, and autopoiesis being secured not existentially, as Rosch puts it, but logically. In which case, as I said before, sovereignty is not sovereign because it shares the same logical structure, indeed what Esposito calls the same finitude, as all the other social systems. And so, ironically enough, insofar as we are able to secure a proper, that is to say, self-referential and immune definition of the political, we will also unavoidably end up with a concept of the political that is in fact weak. But the political, I think, is weak and blind in another more important sense that's not limited to its logical status, one we've already alluded to above in our discussion of the control of control, namely in its inability to overdetermine and steer the autopoiesis of the other social systems, especially, I would add, the economic system. This fact was very much in evidence in the United States in the wake of QE2 and QE3, so-called, the policy of quantitative easing, and the various political responses to the 2008 economic crisis. And it's very much in evidence now in the U.S. in the growing realization that, quote-unquote, getting tough on immigration would in effect economically paralyze cities such as Houston, where I live. As Hans-Georg Müller suggests, on this point, Luhmann would appear to be in agreement with economists such as John Gray at the London School of Economics, who holds that, quote, the idea of modernization to which the IMF adheres is a positivist inheritance. The social engineers who labor to install free markets in every last corner of the globe see themselves as scientific rationalists, but they are actually disciples of a forgotten cult, unquote. Moreover, and in more general terms, the political system is weak because, as Michael King and Chris Thornhill point out, in the political system, power is in fact divided and communicated between a great number of distinct sites and institutions, such as legislators, lobbyists, cabinet ministers, protest groups, civil servants, appointees, and the like, many of which cannot be directly identified with what we would commonly call the state. But this weakness, its loose coupling to other social systems, you might say, is in fact a source of the political system's durability and resilience. As they point out, the vast majority of issues in society, quote, require neither power nor collectively binding decisions, unquote. Problems such as what investments to choose, deciding on a course of treatment for an illness, choosing which college to attend, and so on, quote, have no directly political content and may be regulated respectively in the systems of economics, medicine, art, or law, unquote. Now, one might object that the political system does indeed intervene in these systems all the time in the form of addressing fair access to costly drugs for certain groups of people, let's say, or by taking on corruption or fraud in the financial markets. But as Thornhill and King point out, these interventions actually serve to, quote, elucidate and reinforce the differentiation between one system and another, unquote. To make sure, for example, that access to appropriate drugs is based precisely on medical need alone and not on external factors such as race or gender or class, and that financial loss or profit is produced by factors of economic performance and not by unfair advantages in the market gained by extra economic means such as insider information. And so, they argue, the application of political power, quote, thus has its most specific function in the avoidance or obviation of unnecessary structural coupling, unquote. And what this means, to borrow Derrida's phrase, is that democracy may be suicidal, but society isn't, precisely because society is ecological or metabiological. Now, this fact about the political may seem frustrating to some people, and indeed it's bound to be if you think that the properly political is about eschatology or redemption or authenticity or ontological transformation or self-realization of the human race. On the other hand, this weak concept of the political, its inability to unilaterally change whatever happens in the other system, in the other social systems, might be frustrating when our people are in power. And if you don't believe me, talk to those who were enraptured by Obama's election in the United States. But it's quite a relief when their people are in power, especially if we think that they are crazy. And of course, that's exactly the situation in the United States right now and over the past 25 years. Half the country thinks the other half the country is crazy. Not we disagree, not we have substantive policy disagreements, but your version of reality is insane. And here, I think we do well to avail ourselves of what Kenneth Burke, writing in the 1940s, in the face of the rise of fascism and the infatuation of many of his New York intellectual friends with the Communist Party, called Comic Frames of Acceptance. While tragedy, to quote Northrop Frye, quote, seems to lead up to an epiphany of law, of that which is and must be, thus leaving us with a sense of the supremacy of impersonal power and the limitations of human effort, unquote. Comedy for Burke, as John McGowan characterizes it, quote, is pluralistic and tolerant, accepting, albeit ambivalently, the coexistence of others with whom we disagree. Lacking the comic frame, he continues, the demos shatters into factions and begins to long for a strong authoritarian leader to bring law and order to the chaotic multiplicity of a pluralistic polity, unquote. A point with considerable resonance for the current electoral cycle, I would suggest. The comic frame is thus not about sovereignty and not about the sacrifice and scapegoating that sovereignty by definition entails. And crucially, it requires of us, quote, an acceptance of nature and of the body that does not ask to be redeemed by any beyond, unquote, including the ethnically and racially marked body, subtended, as it always is finally, with the hierarchy of the human and the animal. In characteristically iconoclastic terms, Burke rejects what he calls the tragic perfecting of victimage that is on display for him, as it is for Esposito's immunitary thanatopolitics, in, quote, the Hitlerite promoting of social cohesion through the choice of the Jew, unquote. Possessed of the comic frame of acceptance, the critic will, quote, accept it that the pieties of others are no less real or deep, though being different from his, and in taking account as best he can of his own self-referential biases, foibles, habits, and so on, will accept, quote, the dwarfing of our impatience by never forgetting that men build their cultures by huddling together, nervously loquacious on the edge of an abyss, unquote. Here, I think we find a strong point of connection between Burke's comic frame and systems theory's insistence on the constitutive role of the blind spot of autopoiesis and observation and self-reference, one that allows us to skirt the problems associated with Burke's humanism, namely that adopting comic frames of acceptance can readily sound like simply a matter of taking thought and having a good attitude. Quote, by, quote, generalizing guilt, by making us all responsible for the abiding fact of conflict and disagreement, by accepting that all of us retain differences that are not fully compatible with the prevailing order, the comic frame, McGowan writes, and I'm quoting again, eschews the fantasy that one great purgative killing could save us from the slings and arrows of our daily interactions, from the inefficiencies of democracy, unquote. But here, we can note the same thing about Burke's guilt that we noted about Esposito's melancholy, namely that from the vantage of an impersonal theory of the social and the political, All we have here, in all its mundanity, is systems theory's point that collective guilt issues from the fact that all observations are contingent, selective, blind, and bound by the fact of their own self-reference. Last paragraph. Does this blindness have fatal implications for the comic perspective on the political? I don't think so. In fact, it's a condition of its possibility. It may be true, as McGowan puts it, that quote, comedy of the secular mundane variety requires an acceptance of finitude and a belief in the possible effectiveness of action, unquote. But this need not mean that action and affirmation are simply a matter of taking thought. And that's precisely why we need a radically impersonal theory of the social, one accompanied by a requisite theory of social complexity and the complex ecology in which the intentionality of political effectivity is always already embedded. Rather, it means in a way that it's a matter of doing the impossible, acting on the basis of contingencies, not grounds. When we reconceptualize what Burke called the collective body of the social in these ecological terms, then this blindness isn't what prevents political action and affirmation, it's in fact what makes it possible. Thank you. Sorry that was so long. You want, Courtney, you want to do Q&A or? Okay.
You can just call on people. That was dense, so give us.
Yeah, that was a lot to take in. Yeah, I know. It's kind of hyper abstract. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wondered, since it went by, like quickly towards the end, I was a question about the avoidance of the metaphysics of the individual and return to the comic plane.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I guess just a couple questions orbiting around that. I mean, like I love the turn to Burke, because I was reading Burke, it's like, I feel like he's sort of always the smartest guy in the room and stuff. But,
But nobody reads Burke anymore, as far as I can tell.
But is it like as good as it seems? I mean, like reading something like Attitudes Toward History now. I mean, it reminds me of reading like Contingency, Irony, Solidarity, or something. Like it's still like the vibe now is sort of this like kind of Gordian liberalism. And I'm wondering, is there a way? I mean, for you to like Burke actually, since really what it seems like it comes down to in terms of like Burke's actual politics, it's just like, well, I mean, it makes sense in terms of the late 1930s, the early 1940s.
Yeah.
But in the in the moment that we're in now, again, it seems like it kind of, I mean, like I feel like I'm reading like Rorty except a much better writer or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm reading Burke.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of wondering about the metaphysics of the individual and even the notion of like comedy itself. I'm like, there's other people like Calvin and Francis, you could probably talk about this better than I could, but like Agamben's was the end of the poem where it begins by talking about why is Dante's comedy called a comedy?
Right.
And what it actually gets to is that in the comedy you get for the first time the metaphysics of the modern individual.
Right.
So there's something that's actually really essential about maybe a slightly different version of the comic, but still one that
Right.
might sort of filter into
Right.
Burke's theory. So like I said, sort of a lot of stuff kind of orbiting around it. But what I'm really wondering is about the tension between
Yeah.
the metaphysics of the individual and a sort of ecological perspective. I mean, whether you can really hook the two up. I mean, especially the sort of Burkean model.
Well, yeah, I mean, the texts we're talking about here are these texts that Burke wrote in the 40s called Attitudes Toward History and Permanence and Change. And they're big, long, crazy books.
Mm-hmm.
If they're like Rorty, it's like Rorty on LSD. I mean, they're intellectually ambitious, but also to say idiosyncratic would be a real understatement about these books. Because most people, what they know about Burke, is the political motives, the grammar motives, philosophy of literary form, but these are much crazier books than those books. The key link for me with Burke through this conduit of comedy is that comedy, the oldest saw in the book about comedy is that tragedy, represents human beings as greater than they are. Comedy represents human beings as lesser than they are. And that means animalistic, finally, at the end of the day. And so for me, what Burke does with comedy is to actually take us back to animality through a relationship to the body. And a relationship to the body that does not follow a sacrificial regime or has to follow a redemptive logic, but is one that's not scared of the body, right? And doesn't feel that the body has to be redeemed or purged or transcended in some way. And also in these books, by taking seriously, as he does, the biological, physical, and evolutionary needs, drives, and the lack of direct accessibility thereof of human beings and their civilizations. So Burke says this involves a shift of perspective from good times to bad times as the norm, and a shift from virtue to vice as the norm, since virtues are by definition rare. And so it's a complete frame shift, I think, in terms that for which comedy in Burke's usage becomes a kind of metonymy, I think, for this move into what he actually calls a metabiological theory of society and social complexity. Now, the thanatopolitical side of this we know all too well, which is the literalization of the body politic that eventuates in Nazi Germany and the treatment of the Jews, and a literalization of the immunitary paradigm within that body politic and what that body has to purge to remain healthy. But that aspiration toward health and purity is not one that Burke's metabiological frame shares, right? And it's interesting that it's interesting that he's doing this at a historical moment where he really is kind of navigating between the rise of fascism on the one hand and a set of suspicions about communism on the other hand that a lot of his New York intellectual friends don't share. And so what he's really trying to do is I think he's trying to think what we now talk about, post all the work on Schmitt and post all the work in political theory. What we now talk about is constitutive social or democratic antagonism, but how antagonism takes place within a comic rather than a tragic frame. Having said that, you're absolutely right, and I've turned to this briefly at the end of the talk, that you do have to confront Burke's humanism. And the way Burke tries to confront his own humanism is by a weird kind of Freudo-Marxism that winds its way through permanence and change and attitudes toward history, and by taking seriously what psychoanalysis would call the unconscious. That's his way of trying to deal with the fact that human beings, it's not as if the intentionality of human beings can be evacuated in terms of their thinking about their political effectivity. It's the fact that, as one theorist put it, there's what you think you're doing, there's what you're actually doing, and then there's what you're doing does. And when you're talking about political effectivity, those are three different things that are often quite asynchronous, right? And Burke's way of trying to think that, I think, is through this kind of weird Freudo-Marxism that he engages in. But finally, I think we have other resources now, I think, for thinking, and Esposito has his own version of this as well, in thinking a kind of more impersonal theory of the social into which political effectivity could be kind of reinserted, right? So it's not that's why I said at the end, it's a matter of doing the impossible. I mean, you have to act, you have to make your best call, you have to act on the basis of good reasons, but you also know that that's far from an exhaustive account of how politics happens and what political effectivity is. Yeah, everybody should go read Permanence and Change and Attitudes toward History. It's the weirdest. I mean, just for fun, if nothing else, they were the weirdest books. Yeah.
Maybe this will pick up on this just a bit. I'm curious because this might be a question. The answer is kind of already embedded in here. I'm just wondering maybe you can bring it out a bit more. I was waiting kind of as you began speaking, I had Hagelin actually in the back of my mind, and you
Mhm.
mentioned him, and his book, it seems, is a very, the whole project of that is a resistance to it, you know, the ethics of deconstruction, or what he says these other critics have talked about as far as the ethics of deconstruction go. And I'm curious because I know we're talking about politics here quite a bit too, but I don't think the term ethics came up quite as much, and I'm curious if you think that, is Hagelin sort of participating too in this as far as what you are trying to work through here with the biopolitical and reintroducing the political, or is the ethical something that is different from this project, or how do you relate those two, I guess?
Well, Hagelin's relationship to this is that his reading of Derrida maps very, very readily onto a systems theory theoretical apparatus. So what you get in Hagelin's reading of Derrida is what I would call a hyper-infrastructural reading of the whole Derridian apparatus of iterability, difference, so on and so forth, right? In relation specifically to time and temporality, right? In this project, where the ethical enters, and this is where you got to remember Luhmann and Derrida converge on the same space from opposite ends of the problem. For Luhmann, the ethical is a danger, actually. And what Luhmann's, and you got to remember, Luhmann is a German intellectual of a certain generation who was conscripted as a young man to fight in the Nazi army. And so what Luhmann's account, just to put it very telescopically, is that once we move into modernity as a phenomenon of functional differentiation, the church no longer has a central place as a kind of anchor, you know, or a compass foot around which the other social systems really organize themselves. And at the same time, the moral code, good, bad, or good, evil, then detaches itself from the church and from that system and becomes kind of a floating, you know, morality becomes kind of a floater that's no longer anchored in the specific social site. And it threatens, therefore, from Luhmann's point of view, to always reach in and recode or transcode the binary codes of the other autopoietic social systems in ways that are dangerous, right? So that what you end up with, just to like fast forward, you end up with The Handmaid's Tale, basically. And so Luhmann's point is, you know, do you really want the code knowledge ignorance within the education system? Do you really want that to be parasitically transcoded by the moral code good evil? Probably not, right? And you can see why, from Luhmann's point of view, you know, that these are always in the background because of his experience. In the background is always the danger, which for a lot of U.S. intellectuals is not a danger, it's an aspiration called totalization. But for him, it's a danger. And so his relationship to functional differentiation and to liberalism generally is really, really different and in some ways almost opposed, I think, to what most U.S. academics, you know, have grown up with as something that's never had any competition and needs to be overcome, you know, through some kind of Archimedean totalization, right? And so for him, the moral code and questions of ethics are ones that have to be kind of, again, handled in an immunitary fashion so that the autopoiesis and the autonomy of the different social systems doesn't get transcoded in terms of morally right, morally wrong, you know. And I have to say, I think in the United States, this is a real problem, you know. I mean, in our public culture, in our political culture, and God knows you can talk to people who teach in different state universities, University of Texas, for example, which is run by the Board of Regents appointed by Rick Perry. You know, those people have, I think, reason to worry about the distinction between what we call knowledge and ignorance within, you know, the educational system being transcoded as morally good, morally bad, right? So that's how Luhmann kind of comes at these problems. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's in part coming from just having read Before the Law.
Right?
And at one point he said that the environment produces new schemas of politicization. And
To use Foucault's phrase, yeah.
I was wondering if, so something that was sort of absent from your talk today, but was a very big part of Before the Law was the idea of the flesh, or you just talked about the relation to the body.
Right.
So I was wondering if there's a thinking of that in the background of this project, just the way in which sort of the relation between the body or the flesh, both human and non-human animal, the way in which it sort of resists this sort of logic of government that you laid out, you know, the sort of government producing conflict in order to then manage it. Is there a way in which
Yeah.
bodies, if bodies are connected to environment in that way, and if bodies, flesh, resist that sort of, that logic, if they operate in excess of that logic in a way?
Yeah, I mean, to put it in Basonian terms, the flesh is a source of noise, or to use another term, complexity, that serves as the resource for new patterns and new challenges for systems that try to reduce complexity by coding it in terms of their own autopoiesis, right? So the problem, I think, with how, I mean, the trope of flesh is actually one that I borrow from Esposito. And Esposito insists, rightly I think, he says, look, the biopolitical does not operate at the level of persons. I mean, Esposito, Foucault, Derrida, Luhmann, and a long list of other people agree that we are not talking about a theory of the social and the political for whom or for which individuals and persons are constitutive elements. They all agree on that, right? And obviously I think they're right. So Esposito takes his place in this by saying, look, we're not talking about subjects, persons, those are ideologies, as he puts it. And we're not even talking about the biopolitical operating at the level of the body. Why? Because there is no such thing as the body, right? If we haven't learned anything else from queer theory, hopefully we have learned that, okay? So there is no such thing as the body. So it operates at the level of what he calls flesh. And he says flesh is the being in common that we share with not just human forms of life, but other forms of life, that then in kind of Deleuzian fashion gets enfolded, right, into modes of embodiment that then we kind of trope as eventually kind of, normate versus non-normate, bodies, right? So that's Esposito's way of coming at this. My point is that whatever life, capital L is, it is always simply the precipitate of empirical instances of the living, the actually existing living that always get taken up and produced in highly specific, highly articulated ways by particular dispositives. This is Foucault's point. So whenever we talk about life, whenever we talk about the living, whenever we talk about flesh, whenever we talk about what is the bio of biopolitics, we always have to go back to the specific particular instantiations of the empirically living by particular dispositives, apparatuses, and social systems, right? And so formally, for me, the way this works is that if you think about the whole sort of blind spot, self-reference blind spot apparatus of systems theory, in these instantiations of self-referential constitutions of the living, life, capital L, is simply that gets pushed outside, right? In the acts of self-reference by particular social systems, right? And of course that accords perfectly with what life, capital L is as kind of a concept. So it's a kind of reservoir. So Luhmann's point about self-reference, as he puts it, is reality is what one does not perceive when one perceives it. Right? So whenever you try to cognize an environment, you're always doing it on the basis of your particular self-reference, which is blind to its own tautology or its own paradox. Right? And so you generate an outside reality is what one does not perceive, and one perceives it through that self-referential act, and that's where life, capital L, is located. And I think that's where flesh is located for me in a way that's different from Esposito in the end comes down in Bios, but in other work too. He comes down in a much more kind of Deleuzean eminence position on this than I would. Right. And that's where this language about the fold and so on comes from for him. Yeah, call me.
Okay, so this is not fully formulated, and I'm still, sort of processing your really dense paper. Don't think I got everything, but I guess I'm sort of like trying to. So my question, I wonder if you can help me out here. I'm trying to just think this through. Is when you sort of talked about the way in which Derrida and Luhmann are coming together from different ends.
Right.
And I'm thinking about, what you said about the autoimmune, and Derrida talks about it, in Rogues and several other,
Right.
sort of, later works. And the metabiological aspect of systems theory, et cetera. So this is already kind of, not fully formulated.
Yeah.
Since you sort of seen them as sort of, overlapping or coming together at some level, to sort of help us rethink the biopolitical, am I correct?
Yeah, I think conceptually the infrastructure, I think of deconstruction and second order systems theory is the same.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. So if that's the case, I'm just wondering, so kind of, is there a way in which, if we stop thinking about the relation between the economic system, Foucault of 1979, right, the birth of biopolitics, right, and Foucault of the biopolitics of medicalization, which is a slightly different kind of a idea of biopolitics. I mean, is there something there in the sense that you're not quite thinking about the way in which the economic logic tends to sort of like, overpower the unitary logic of sovereignty? Or are you thinking along those lines? I mean, is that sort of something that you think about at all? The
Yeah.
space between
Yeah.
sovereignty and
Yeah.
political logic, law,
Yeah.
for instance, of the state, right, the intervention of the state
Yeah.
versus,
Yeah.
the economy,
Yeah.
the economic system,
Yeah.
which perhaps is more open-ended and is about a controlled society in a way that sovereignty, is not
Yeah.
broadly enough.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and we've been doing this year-long after biopolitics seminar. We've read a lot of material around this question. And I feel like what you see in Foucault, and I do think this, I talked about this briefly, but I do think this actually goes all the way back to his mentor, Louis Althusser, and structural Marxism's attempt to think structural causality. I do think what you see in Foucault is someone who's trying to think these qualitative shifts in constitutive social logics as we move from disciplinary society to governmentality, biopolitics. The question of the relationship between that latter phase to liberalism is, of course, a big question in the lectures and for a lot of people. So I see a thinker in Foucault who is grasping for, and you can actually see this even in the history of sexuality, who's grasping for different conceptual models to think social complexity. I mean, to use systems theory language, into which the political and the economic can be reinserted as things that we don't totally know what they are. And we can't totally take for granted what they are, much less how they articulate with each other. So that's the side of Foucault that I think now that we've gotten the lectures, at the Collège de France in translation, this is the Foucault that I think there's a whole re-reception and rereading and re-understanding of Foucault's work and his trajectory that to me looks a lot more like that than the Foucault that I read, as a graduate student and an early professor, which was dominated by discipline and punishment.
Right.
Right? But now we have a much broader broader context. And so the question, I mean, we just read Deleuze's book on Foucault in the seminar, and one of the things that's interesting about this, Greg Flaxman is in the seminar from UNC Chapel Hill, he's in the seminar with us. And one of the interesting things that you see Deleuze worrying about with Foucault is, and you can see him trying to kind of reclaim Foucault in his book on Foucault by giving a really, really Deleuzean reading. I mean, now, especially once you see the lectures, is you can see Deleuze worrying about, wow, what is Foucault's relationship to liberalism? Is Foucault a neoliberal? I mean, in a way, is kind of what you can see animating Deleuze's Foucault and reading of Foucault, and not just there, but in relation to the Material and Control Society, which is contemporaneous with Deleuze's book on Foucault. So I think this is very much, to me, kind of unfinished business. And one of the things I'm trying to do here, as I said at the very beginning, is I'm actually trying to use Luhmann to radicalize Foucault. Because I think Luhmann has a much more powerful conceptual apparatus that you can trace back through Foucault actually to structural causality in structural Marxism, as all of these attempts to think social complexity into which the economic political relation can be reinserted in terms of how they structurally couple and how they don't structurally couple. So the distinction I was trying to make at the beginning is that one question to dwell on here, I think, is the extent to which Foucault thinks that governmentality and liberalism is actually able to steer its processes more than a second-order social theory like Luhmann's insists is not possible. Because highly organized complexity of the sort that we have now in Luhmann's scheme is actually highly improbable and highly precarious. But that's also what actually makes it durable, resilient, and flexible, is the fact that there's no there in a way. And so what I was trying to draw attention to is the question of the extent to which Foucault remains within a kind of first order logic that basically says, yeah, governmentality and liberalism, kind of largely achieves what it thinks it's achieving and constitutes this different social logic. And Luhmann's point is that no, you have to actually think this from the other end of the problem, which is highly improbable, and the kind of steering that involves is actually impossible within this more kind of metabiological theory of social complexity, into which we then rethink the political and the economic and so on. So that's the sense in which I'm trying to kind of use the Luhmannian apparatus to sort of extend and I think radicalize in a way what Foucault is doing, using the immunitary paradigm as the jumping off point. So and I think there's a ton of unfinished business here, including Foucault's relationship to liberalism and to neoliberalism. We have Wendy Brown actually coming to the seminar next week, and she's written about this in her latest book. So it's a huge question, and I think an ongoing question. Yeah.
So my takeaway from what you just said, if I may, and I'm going to put it really crudely,
Yeah.
is that in your view, it doesn't make sense to sort of think in the terms of the relations between the state, or does Foucault have a theory of the state in the Birth of Biopolitics, which and the economic and the economic system that he's theorizing there in Birth of Biopolitics. Because in my view, what's happening in 1979 is something very different from what happened in the earlier seminars. The Birth of Biopolitics is just a very strange lecture course, right?
As he himself admits.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out. I mean, it's probably not a good question at all. I think it's telling me that I shouldn't be posing the question in this way, right? But I'm just a really crude thinker, I guess. And I just want to know, how to map the relation or the
the non-relation,
Yeah.
that's the thing, the non-relation between the state and the economy,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
And-
Luhmann's point is the political is just the political. And democracy is just democracy. You know?
Yeah, but Foucault in Birth of Biopolitics is about how we don't have that stuff anymore, right? I mean, all we have is the logic of, you know, of human capital, right? And all we have is the market logic, and we have economic imperialism. So you're talking about Gary Becker,
Yeah.
Friedman,
Right.
and all this is kind of guys, you know, and that's the only thing that rules. And really, the state has withdrawn itself completely. Whereas in the earlier seminars, right, he started talking about how with biopolitics, you have the state coming back into the picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So
Well,
it's
yeah,
kind
and
of
this is
confusing. So
well, and this is something that even Schmidt talks about, right? Schmidt's critique of liberal, or one of his critiques of liberalism, is about the collapsing of the state into just the juridical, essentially the collapsing of the juridico-political just into the juridical, right? And so, from a Luhmannian point of view, this is about the same problem, which is the inability, and actually not just the inability, but actually the resistance of the state and by the state to try to steer and overdetermine and guide the autopoiesis of the other social systems, including the economic system, right? Now, the extent to which that can be equated with neoliberalism, I think is a different question. Because for me, one of the constituent features of neoliberalism is the radical redistribution and polarization of wealth, right? And that doesn't necessarily follow from the kind of theory of social complexity and the relationship between the economic and the political that I think we see in Luhmann's work, right? I mean, it's not a necessary consequence, right, of that redescription. Part of what's complicated here, and then I'll shut up. Part of what's complicated here is that the theoretical models that subtend ecological systemic thinking are themselves, in a sense, economic.
right.
But that doesn't make them neoliberal.
No.
Right. Right. And so if you go back to some of the founding works of
No, no, Derrida.
that's right.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So if you go back to some of the founding works in theoretical biology or ecology, the models in cybernetic thinking in general, the models can be called in some sense economic. That does not make them ideological symptoms
Right.
of neoliberalism,
Right.
as some thinkers from the left want to claim.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of one of the important hinges here that I think needs to be navigated. I just think that to talk about the political at all, and to talk about it in relation to the economic and the other social systems, I just think we have to have a much more complex theory, a kind of requisite social complexity, into which we can reinsert what is the relationship between the political and the economic, right? And I think that's what Foucault is. I think that what we can see now after the lectures is a very different picture of Foucault's engagement of that whole question that we didn't have before we got the lectures in translation, right? And it makes more visible, I think, a line that then stretches up through what Luhmann's trying to do. Yeah.
I was wondering, and this is more of a tangent, if you could comment possibly on this Positive's new book, Persons and Thing, where the body appears as sort of the horizon of a new possible affirmative biopolitics, especially because you just mentioned body.
Yeah, I haven't read that book yet, so I can't comment on it. One thing I'm really attracted to in Esposito's work, and I have been from the beginning, is, I share with him, and I actually think, we talked about this at lunch today, I think a lot of people share with him the desire to think the relationship between, let's just in shorthand say, the political and life in ways that don't circle back to a thanatopolitical result. I think that interest is broadly shared. What does it mean to continue to think about all the things that people are interested in biopolitics think about, but using a different kind of theoretical apparatus? I think a lot of people share that interest. I think that Esposito, and what I was trying to zero in on here with all the stuff about guilt and melancholy and perversion and lack, to make a long story short, I think Esposito, as I said at lunch today, half of Esposito wants to be Derrida, half of Esposito wants to be Agamben, and he can't figure it out. And so you have a thinker who insists that the person, there's a great essay of his called The Person in Human Life in the collection Theory After Theory that talks about this. It talks about a lot of places, that the person, the individual, and so on is not what we're talking about, can't have a theory of the social, and then he falls back into the semantics of guilt, lack, perversion, melancholy, and so on. And I think this is symptomatic of this split in Esposito's thinking. And I'm not even going to get into the fact that we're talking about, a philosopher coming out of an Italian Catholic philological background either. But there are people, including feminist thinkers, who've talked about this aspect of us, who see Esposito as a very theological thinker in many ways, and see his concept of life onto which one would hang an affirmative biopolitics as being a quite pretty conventionally theological sort of concept as well. And I share that suspicion, I would say. I'm reading third person right now, but I haven't read the book you're talking about. Yeah.
This is a fairly simple question. And I think it's partly from my own kind of a relative unfamiliarity with Iman's work. But I'm kind of curious, is there something specific about systems that you want to kind of hang on to? I mean, of course, it's drawn in a long theory and tradition. But I'm just kind of curious about thinking about system, the term itself, and the relationship between systems. I mean, because in a crude model, and I'm thinking of in fiction, like something like Pynchon's work, where there are different systems relating to each other, but they end up kind of all reproducing a capitalist logic.
Right.
I'm just kind of curious what is specific to system in Iman's work that's worth hanging on to in order to kind of extend and radicalize Foucault, as you're suggesting.
This is where, actually, this is a new piece that I've written that's overlaps with this, but it's for a special issue of this journal called New Geography. Actually, it's coming out from Harvard School of Design called New Geographies, special issue on the concept of islands. But this is why I think insisting on self-reference is really, really important, because one side of the ecological paradigm, the everything is connected. If you think ecology means everything is connected, then one side of this is the kind of dark ecology side that we see in people like, it's the paranoid conspiracy side that we became familiar with, and all that kind of great 70s, Metafic carries up through, White Noise by DeLillo and these kinds of characters. That's ecological too, right? In a different way. So what I'm actually attracted to, and this is to connect this with the paper I didn't give today, but I'm actually wedded to Derrida's assertion in the second set of Beast and Sovereign seminars. He works through 3 theses. First thesis is, we all share a common world, we just experience it differently. We'll leave aside the philosophical difficulties of that assertion, but the last thesis, which is the one he affirms, and this is in the context of a reading of Robinson Crusoe, is there is no world. There are only islands, and we create what we call our world through a set of what he calls stabilizing apparatuses. I actually think that you can give a robust scientific account and justification of that statement that reaches all the way back through working theoretical biology and the biology of consciousness to the kind of stuff that Uxkol was doing, right? Because there is no world precisely for the reasons that Uxkol or Alvin Noe that I quoted here, doing biology of consciousness, talks about, right? That all living beings create and inhabit their worlds through their, what Maturana and Varela called, the embodied inaction of their autopoiesis, right? And so the world, quote unquote world, is this virtual space that is produced by different creatures based on their embodied inaction and the neurophysiological substrates that make some kinds of phenomenological experience possible and not others, right? And so virtual for me doesn't mean less real, it means more real in the sense of more multidimensional, right? The world has many more dimensions if you take seriously the fact that it's produced by all the different life forms that converge in a shared space, right? So I think, it sounds like Derrida's just having a massive Heideggerian hangover when he kind of says this, but I think, and there's a lot of work by serious people in theoretical biology like MacArthur Fellow Stuart Kaufman, but others as well, that I think enables you to say, no, this actually is exactly right. And that is the most radically ecological position. Because what it means is the world is not given, the world is made. Right? The stabilizing apparatuses, we're the ones who make those. Right? We're the ones who create our world and create our shared worlds. And that's where the question of ethical responsibility lies. What I like about the systems theory model, that I was trying to emphasize here to come to your question, and this goes all the way back to Gregory Bateson for me, that I read as an undergraduate, is that it makes it clear that time in dynamic system states is crucial to talking about meaning. So the quotation I gave from Luhmann about reading about the Deutschmark falling in value in the newspaper. It's not about the formal informatic features of a given utterance for a given item. It's about how those are taken up at the particular moment in the dynamic state of the system, right? And so already, to me, you just have a much more complex, and there's a Derridian deconstructive version of this as well that Hagelin tries to draw out. But just starting there means you have a much more, I think, robust way of talking about how across ontological domains, how systems operate and how meaning gets taken up and what kind of impact it has, whether it's political impact or phenomenological impact.
Since you talked about this at lunch, I've had a lot of time to think about it, and one of the issues it raises for me, the idea that there are all these different islands and versions of world being created by conscious beings, is that places a lot of ethical weight on what gets to have a consciousness. And I feel like it would be very easy for that to then descend into a binary where you decide what life forms, like when you get into the gray area, like viruses, etc. That places a lot of ethical burden on what gets to have a consciousness and what doesn't. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts as to how we navigate that and how we keep from simplifying that. How do we encounter the possibility of consciousness in all sorts of different objects or beings without trying to reduce it?
Yeah, no, this is a really central question that I take up in Before the Law in about a 20-page section that ends up with what I call the scandal of the cephalopods, right? And the scandal of the cephalopods is when we talk about worlds, and I'm just for now talking in a very narrow and familiar domain of these questions that a lot of people have talked about, of saying, well, okay, let's just start with gorillas and bonobos and dolphins, and kind of see where that goes, right? The scandal of the cephalopods is that these kinds of worlds that we're talking about, and this kind of consciousness that you're talking about, has typically been taken to involve creatures who have relatively long lifespans and who live in relatively large social groups. And oh, by the way, most of all are chordates vertebrates, right? Because that's where you get the concentration of neural tissue that gives you the requisite plasticity, neurophysiological plasticity that then can be rewired in relation to the prosthetic exteriority of your experience of different spaces, different social interactions, developmentally, so on and so forth, right? And that's where thrownness comes from. That's where design comes from. The scandal of the cephalopods is none of these things applies to cephalopods. They're not vertebrates. They live short lives. We're talking about squids, octopi, and so on. Relatively short-lived, don't live in big social groups. And they're not vertebrates, and yet these domains, these metacommunicative frames, to use Bateson's language, that you see in things like play, right, have been observed quite robustly in these creatures, right? So the biopolitical point of this is, if we haven't learned anything else from biopolitics, we have learned whatever those things are that you think are important, you should always resist the temptation to index them to a zoological or biological or racial taxonomy, including being a vertebrate. And so to me, the lesson, and it's the lesson you see from the history of science, is, you know, that those lines and those characteristics are moving and shifting all the time. We think about the difference between how we think about non-human creatures now and 100 years ago. Right? So, and this is where as I say in the book, this is where Heidegger is right to say that the being of beings is not a being. Right? And this is where the side of Derrida that's interested in that side of Heidegger, I think, is really, really important to hang on to. And all we know is that, as I say in the book, all we know is that wherever we draw those lines, and I actually don't think it's even about consciousness finally, but wherever we draw those lines, what we do know, to put it in Derridian terms, is we will have been wrong, for sure. And it's just a question of how quickly we will be shown to have been wrong. I mean, the history of science shows that, if nothing else, in terms of what we know about non-human creatures. So you know, the idea that, you know, only certain zoological taxonomies can be said or predicted to have these things that we care about, whatever they are. And there's a lot of debate right now about where that is. I mean, you know, anybody could tell in the liberal logic of incorporation that eventuates in fill-in-the-blank studies, the latest of which is animal studies, anybody could tell that the next shoe to drop would be, what about plants? My feeling about plants is fine. It's actually not about animals or plants. It's not about those taxonomies. But it is about the fact that when we're making ethical and political decisions about different forms of life that have standing and that deserve immunitary protection, we have to make these decisions all the time. And we do make them all the time, right? But we make them in the knowledge that, as I said, you know, we will have been wrong. And I think that's all we can do, you know. And that doesn't mean that there's a single, you know, gold standard for standing. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. This goes way back in environmental ethics. You know, there's all sorts of reasons for respecting different forms of life, viruses, bacteria, whatever, you know, that may not fit this particular description. You know, but it just means that those reasons are different kinds of reasons, from talking about, you know, consciousness or, you know, the standard you're invoking. So that's a really important question. And what I do in Before the Law is say, well, let's just start there. Let's just take kind of let's just take an obvious case and see where that goes. And that case is, you know, non-human animals. Yeah.
So a few minutes ago, you said the word play, which I've been thinking about that word for an hour now.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking about the title of your talk. And one thing I want to say is that Bataille, in his book on erotism, just takes for granted that all organisms, including single-cell organisms, have inner experience. And I think it's remarkable that his whole theory is based on something that he just takes for granted, which I kind of love in a way.
Yeah.
So what I'm really curious about is if we will always be wrong, if the system is driven by what it cannot, by definition, see.
Yeah.
Is there a sense in which all politics that one could stand behind or believe in or affirm would have to incorporate the idea of play somehow? That is, that you're not transcoding a good, bad, good, evil binary on whatever it is that is suppressed or excluded. It's
No.
kind of an unfair question maybe, but that's what I'm thinking.
Well, no, I mean, I think that, to me, that's another way of putting the comic perspective of Burke's that I'm invoking at the end of the talk. I mean, beginning with play, to kind of stitch this together, to me means where you begin is with not sublimating your own self-reference and your own blindness. Now, this feeds into a lot of contemporary discussions about, what Chantal Mouffe does in Returning Political, of constitutive social antagonism, as not being something that needs to be solved and overcome in the name of some vision of the good or the true or some rational liberal consensus even, but it's something that's inescapable and has, in Bill Rausch's point, and has to be made visible, right, and not disguised, and has to affirm the contingencies of its own processes, its own self-reference. Because if you take Schmitt seriously, and you take the Schmittian kind of rendering of sovereignty and a kind of a decisionist view of sovereignty seriously, sovereignty is madness. The sovereign decision is a form of madness, always, right? Logically speaking, right? It's as Bill Rausch puts it, it's an act of logical nuclear fission, And so if you start there, then you have a different, it seems to me, then you have a much more, as you say, kind of, playful or comic view of democratic antagonism and its differences. What you don't have is the desire that I think we see now in the current electoral cycle, in a particularly American flavor called populism desire, to have that antagonism eradicated, banished, sent back to Mexico. Pick your paradigm, right? And so that's kind of where the stakes are, and that's not playful, and that's not comic either. And it's not a very satisfying. I often say this is like the most deflationary political theory talk you could possibly hear, because it's not a satisfying or redemptive or galvanizing view of the political, But like I said, when their people are in power, I think it looks a little different. You're kind of glad that George Herbert Walker Bush or George W. Bush, on the basis of his Christian religious convictions, can't reconstitute and steer all the other social systems based on that moral code. I'm actually happy in that circumstance that we have this kind of weak concept, this weak concept of the political that secures its own self-reference, actually by precisely its inability to dominate the other social instances. I'm glad in that situation that the political is only the political, and that the political is weak, And of course, when our people are in power, then it sucks. We're like, well, Obama can't fix anything. It's like, well, actually, Obama can't fix most things. That's how it works, right? So you're right. It is a, and play play in the comic sense, but also in this more biological sense that I was invoking earlier. I mean, it's an important part of the argument. But that's the sense in this talk that I think is the dominant sense.
I mean, I guess
Yeah.
the danger with thinking about play in the way I'm tempted to is that it trivializes the effects of a political system that does code everything as good or bad, right? I mean, you don't want to trivialize people's suffering, but at the
No.
same time, you want to acknowledge that any attempt to ease that suffering in a systematic way is going to have blind spots and it's going to need further correction, which will need further correction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. But I think, as I said earlier, for me, an important aspect of the Burkean rendering of the comic is that it actually reconnects us to the body, and it reconnects us to our shared finitude. But our shared finitude is not something that we can fantasize in the name of the political could ever be solved or overcome or transformed by some sacrificial or sovereign act, right? And to me, then that actually opens onto a different view of the social body, that involves the finitude that we share, and not just with human beings, right? And the second form of that finitude is what you just invoked, that whatever actions we try to take to address that first form of finitude, our embodied vulnerability, is always going to see some things and not see other things. And that's inescapable. That's not something that needs to be redeemed or fixed. That's what politics is, right? And so that's the double finitude that I talk about in the introduction to what is posthumanism.
Great. I think we're past time, and this is
Okay.
fantastic. So can I just say thank you so much? It was
My pleasure. Thank you.